everyone, I am Golnoosh Hakim Debar, your professor for qualitative research methods. As you've learned from your readings this past few weeks, qualitative research is subjective in nature, which can open the research to criticism on the trustworthiness and rigor of the work. So you'll want to ensure that you identify limitations and address validity as you proceed not only with your proposal, but also with your thesis research overall. There are 4 steps that you want to consider as you increase and ensure the validity of your qualitative research. Establishing credibility is 1, transferability of data, dependability of data, and conformability are important aspects of qualitative research. You have studied these 4 aspects of research to help you increase the validity of your data and in your research and reading to ensure that this validity is established. As you consider the credibility of the internal validity of your qualitative data, think about the richness and depth of the data you collect. Remember, in qualitative research, it is not the number of interviews or large samples that you select, but rather the detailed and extensive amount of information you're able to collect from a smaller group. In some of your posts, we have discussed whether you can test a small population and make inferences about a larger group. This question refers to external validity, also known as transferability of data. It is very different. So qualitative research, it is very different than quantitative studies. Your results, if valid, could be transferred to a similar situation in a different setting, but will not provide any information about a larger population. The context and situation are key in establishing external validity. So, as a researcher, you must clearly and thoroughly explain the context of your research so other researchers can transfer the data to similar settings for the same results. The 4 aspects of validity are key to a strong qualitative research. Make sure that you are familiarizing yourself with these 4 aspects of validity and establish a clear plan for testing the validity of your research. As you proceed with your research, you will also face limitations in your study. One of these limitations is bias. There are many types of bias, which can range from research bias to selection bias. It's often researchers that find it quite difficult to admit that there is bias, as they see it as a personal shortcoming when there is bias in the research. But in qualitative research, identifying your bias is a skill set and would improve your research by making sure that bias is staying in the preparatory phase of your research and not becoming part of the data collection phase or the data analysis phase of your research. So to understand the extent of bias, think about the language you use, your familiarity and professional culture, the culture that you grew up in, your social and personal settings. All this could influence how you see the world, and they can lead to bias. Once you have identified a bias that could influence your research, if you identify it early in your research, you'll be able to think through how to avoid and overcome the bias, both in your data collection and in your data analysis. You'll want to be able to remove yourself as much as possible as a researcher and separate your beliefs from the readings and engaging that you take on prior to your data collection. Use the strongest benevolent reading and look at the strongest arguments. throughout the research process, you will continually remind yourself, or you'll be continually reminded to read on your topic. The more you advance your reading and reading opposing arguments through the counter research that you conduct, and even constructing opposite viewpoints, the more likely you're going to identify the bias in your research and address it early in the research process. There's several different types of bias you should remain aware of as you proceed with your research. Here are some of them that I'm listing here for you. Publication bias, selection bias, sample bias, admission rate bias, non-response bias, subject recall bias. There are other types of bias that you may come across, but these are some of the biases that are more common and can be identified in most research. And you should be aware of this as you process and proceed with your work. As you continue to think and process your research, especially with your research design, be aware and think about your research, and that your research must represent an argument to the reader. Your argument should be supported by data and reason and be persuasive. Often researchers, when they are drafting the sections of the research, they tend to focus on the background information quite a lot. It's easier to present the information that you read in articles and other sources directly as facts rather than argue your position against them. This is why most writing is initially focused on background, because you are presenting everything you read as facts. So you may also recall this from previous studies that you've had, or in this program or before, that argument persuasion can be made through 3 different forms of persuasion. Ethos, which is appeal to credibility or trust. Pathos, which is appeal to emotions. And logos, which is appeal to logic. Logos is, as an appeal to logic, is in order to support an argument. So you'll spend a significant amount of time collecting data in order to support your argument in a logical way, and the argument will be connected to your research question or the claim that you're presenting in your thesis. Your literature review will be used to construct and structure your argument, and you will eventually use the data that you've collected to support this argument and persuade your reader of your position. Keep this persuasive language in mind as you proceed to write sections of your research. Your research question is central, and in a qualitative research, each section that you design should remain focused on the research question, so that you are able to support your argument with the data that you're collecting. Previously, you may have worked on a research proposal. As part of this proposal, you may have presented what you believe would be the expected outcome of your research. I recommend that you return to this proposal that you may have created and think about how to best systematically approach your research in order to argue for your proposed outcome. Have a wonderful week. I look forward to seeing you online this week.